let's talk about essentially the three pillars. And that is where we have concentrated the curriculum based on all the TA conversations you all have been having since the beginning of your first survey. So we've tried to pull together the information that you said you've needed for what your pain points are at your organization. And I'm going to, there we go. Oops, too fast. One more back. So the three areas are the following: financial stability, intentional inputs, and programmatic excellence. Is this resonating for folks? Okay, great. You will find by the end of today that if you have, there we go. If you have a need that we don't answer, it's because you haven't told us said need. You are going to see many a QR code, many a piece of paper for you to write input that we're going to put in our basket. Folks walking around asking, what can we do? How are things? We want to know what it is that you need so we can tailor the curriculum for those needs. So help us help you in a sense. I'm going to start with, maybe if I just stand closer over here. The reason I'm not on the stage is, I'm already 6'2", 3. I feel very gorilla, over the city, standing up on that stage. So I'm over here. I know if that's okay with everybody. The fundraising landscape, I don't have to tell you all, is just traditionally difficult. You're asking folks for money. You're trying to be the most important thing on their to-do list. But since this year, it is a place it has never been before. The level of uncertainty is astronomical. I was talking with someone in their back about, our 5-year plan, ha, 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 right? Your 2-year plan, giggles. Like 6 months is a long horizon in the current funding landscape. And it is not only on those who are receiving the funds, but for those who are giving funds. Their endowments, their boards are also in these big planning meetings of how to handle what is happening. That is not a political judgment. That is simply the landscape is shifting, and how do we work to continue to serve our communities in this environment? So anyone know that there's about 1.6 million nonprofits in the United States, the vast majority of which are small. Small in the nonprofit sense is under $1 million. But where does all that great money go that all these folks seem to be getting? You would assume it's going to the big boys, right? 96% of all those trillions goes to this little bitty percentage of folks over here. This group actually shifts more toward larger organizations, which is great on one hand, but it also sort of condenses your availability of funding on the other hand. So what is the landscape of that funding? This is a traditional picture of about a third, as we know, comes from the US government through some sort of channel. It may come from the US government to your state, to your county, and to you. It could come directly from the federal government, depending on the programs with which you are working. 50% of it is fee for service. Who can define fee for service for us? Yes, ma'am. Perfect. Provide a service that you get paid directly for from the participant or from the participant's sponsor, like a Section 8 housing voucher, right? You're not getting it directly from the tenant, but the tenant sponsor is providing you for it. The reason this is half is because there's some inflated numbers in here because nonprofit hospitals are in here, as well as universities and colleges. If you were to take that out, that half kind of halves by taking those two big chunks out. The one that, when looking through all your 990s, and yes, I have looked through all your 990s, is donations and individuals. You all are very low in the percentage of your individual giving campaigns that you have. Does anyone think that they do it well? Okay, I believe you. Colorado is a rich state in comparison to the nation. And so one of the things that we'll talk about when we get into the options of what you should be looking for going forward, again, in this shifting landscape, is there is a lot of funding to be had by individuals in this state. And it doesn't seem, bless you, an option that you all have explored. And it could just be, that's not how we do things here, right? But we're gonna get into what does that mean for you and is it something you should be pursuing? But every single one of those pieces of the circle has been decreasing over time, even before January of this year. 2.5 years ago, there was actually a change in the US tax code, which highly reduced the number of individual giving because you no longer had to itemize. There are changes in the way foundations have to give their money. Anyone know the percentage Yes, ma'am. That foundations have to give out every year. Correct, 5%. And they try with every ounce of their being not to do it. It's 4.99999. But just like we talked about, they are in these meetings determining how they're going to do that going forward as well. And we want to be working with them because we want to keep those funds coming in and add extra. So plans are nothing, but it is the planning that is important. And that horizon of how you plan 2 years out at this point is really probably unrealistic. What can we be doing next quarter? What could we be doing next year for our programming? You're going to get a little bit down the ways and something's going to happen. A new executive order, new mayor, new council. You have to go back and do it again. We'll talk a little bit this afternoon about, well, how do we plan for financial stability when the planning is like doing it in a hurricane, right? How do you do it? And there really are 3, I don't want to say simple, but short steps to go through. Number 1, where are you now? It's difficult to plan, whether it's 6 months or 3 months out there, of where you want to go when you don't know where you're starting from. We've got some handouts this afternoon to help us walk through that. And it is difficult sometimes. Program people, you have to look at the money and the numbers too. You can't just wait for those reports to come from the finance folks, right? Because they look at those numbers different and say, well, it takes, just $20 to bring everybody through the system, and the program folks roll their eyes, right? There are 2 sides of this. There are the program views and the number of people views, but together in the middle is really where we are going to find the true answers. So once you find out where you are, then you're going to look out there and say, well, what's available? We know those big circles. What's happening in each one of those circles? What are corporations doing? What are foundations doing? What are individuals doing here in our state, here in our region, here in the country? And then, okay, we know what folks are doing, who we want to go after, how we want to go after them. How do you plan for that as an organization? And so again, we'll start that this afternoon, and those will be the type of things you can then follow up with your TA folks about how do we do that? What are the 5 steps? What did we do this week? What are the milestones? All right, I'm going to turn it over to my intentional input folks and take a second. Are there any questions about the financial stability, how we're going to approach it, what we're going to do? Okay. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Now, where do I stand? I feel like we should mix it up a little, right? I'll stand here. So, intentional inputs is our second pillar. What in the world does that mean? Remember, I'm the systems level, higher level person, right, of the group. So, intentional inputs, how I think of it, is obviously as an organization or a program, right, you don't exist on an island. You are operating within an incredibly complex system with multiple external factors and forces, right, that are impacting your ability to create change or to meet your goals. So how I think of this pillar is, how can we more deeply understand some of those factors and address them in a way that's more strategic and intentional, so that it's not that we're kind of out there, right, being affected helplessly by all these forces, but rather how can they become assets? How can they become inputs that rather help us maximize our impact in communities? Okay, so how do we make external factors outside of our program and turn them into kind of more internal or inputs that can maximize our efforts? So we'll go through these kind of examples to help understand what that means. First, and we saw a little bit about this in the data already. A lot of you are doing this well, right? Incorporating and engaging lived experience within your work. I think across different sectors in Colorado in the last few years, we've seen just an explosion of this, right? Efforts to engage people with lived experience, which is amazing. With the SHG and the LIFT Academy, we want to be thinking about engaging lived experience, or you could think of it as any stakeholder groups, really, as a continuum, okay? There is no one-size-fits-all correct way to do this, but rather it's about the intentionality. So there very well may be reasons, for example, that you are way over on this end of the continuum, right? Your program, your organization had to make a decision. You made a decision, and now the best way forward you've decided is to inform, to put out accurate, timely information and make sure the people who need to know that are getting that information, right? There very well may be those instances where that's the right decision. The point is that it's intentional, right? That you're not going there because, ooh, we did not leave enough time, right, to do this type of engagement, or we didn't have the resources, or we just couldn't be bothered, right, for all these other reasons. If it's an intentional decision, given where you are in your development or the question or the issue at hand, where these are more appropriate, then great, right? So part of our curriculum is going to be helping you determine, where do you go on this continuum, right? How do you kind of flex back and forth so you're not just defaulting to one way of engaging with those around you and people with lived experience? This second one, consult, right? I think this is one we use a lot, actually. We actually used it already, right? Surveys, focus groups, interviews, even advisory groups. We're getting information from people. What are you doing with that information, right? And notice, if you can see the graphic up here in consult, right, the arrow's just pointing one way. We are taking information from you. And so the conversation then is, what are you doing with that information, and how do we help make that arrow go back, right? What's the feedback loop? How do you then communicate back how we shifted our decision making or shifted our program based on that information? And then further down the continuum, involve, collaborate. Here you start seeing multi-directional arrows going, right? This is the space of more co-creation, co-creating solutions together. So you're not just taking in information from folks, you're actually seeking their input into, how do we create solutions to these issues? There's some decision making, right? Co-decision making in these types of models, all the way to the top, which is empower, right? Where we actually shift the power and the decision making to those who are most impacted by our programs and our actions. So again, with this curriculum, it's clear from the data, many of you are doing this at some level, at some point in these continuums, right? And so we're not only going to talk about kind of these different forms of engagement, right? And structurally what that looks like, but also, when do you employ which method, right? Which of these types of models or structures make sense in which types of situations, and why? Also, if you look at this continuum, this is really about structure, right? How are we setting up the container, for example, of how we're interacting with people? I've been in groups, I've participated in groups myself, right, where we've incorporated people with lived experience, right? We brought in that one person, they have a vote just like all of us, right? Does that mean that it's meaningful input? Not always, right? So structure is different. Is one thing, but we also have to think about best practices, right? What does it mean to truly engage and fold in people with different life experiences into your discussions and decision making? Because the point is not, this isn't an end in itself, right? We're not looking to check a box saying, we collaborated. We really did, right? Look at who all sits on our advisory council. The point is not to just do this doing its sake. It's to do it to increase the impact of your programs, increase the impact of your work. We have to believe at the core that engaging people with lived expertise, engaging more diverse voices, is making our programs and our work stronger. And that's why we're doing it. So this is one big piece of intentional inputs. A second thing, and this is more at the community level, how do we broaden kind of community awareness, community perceptions? One of the ways to do this is what we're calling community champions, cultivating community champions, right? Cassie and SHG does this really well. They just did it in a community recently. of how do you kind of make sure that messaging and communication isn't just coming from you and your staff, right? Or the typical players in your community, but you're starting to build these broader coalitions, right? You have trusted messengers embedded in different sectors across your community that can help you deliver these messages, that can help positively promote the work within your communities, that can help translate some of your messages based on where they sit within the system. There's also pieces of collecting information, right? Same thing. How do we know, right, what different parts of the community are thinking about certain things? What language are they using? What perceptions do they have? There's formal and informal ways to collect information. In a recent example, SHG actually had their community champions put out a survey to their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, right, to really more formally gather information. But this can be done in a lot of informal ways as well. And then finally, a sounding board, right? You want to test out certain messages. You want to test out certain models or locations for things, right? Utilizing your community champions who know their pockets of the community really well and can act as a sounding board to some of your ideas. So this is another piece of this pillar, right? How do we start broadening and reaching out further into the community? Next, I'm sure many of you, if I asked you right now, you could jot down who are the key players, who are the key stakeholders within your communities, right? Many of us have done some sort of exercises of who are the key stakeholders, or you've done asset mapping of your communities, etc. In this curriculum, we want to go deeper than that, right? It's not just about the who, right, which is important. Who are the big players in your community? But start making all the different connections, right? Who has the formal authority, right, or power within that structure? Where does the more informal influence occur within your system or your community, right? Where are some of the natural kind of coalitions or alignment happening? What are some unnatural or non-traditional coalitions we can start building based on their perceptions? In this picture, you can even see some kind of quotation bubbles, right? This is kind of something we use in human-centered design, where you're literally saying, these are the perceptions, the key mental model or perception of this stakeholder, right? Even getting down to individuals within the community. And so if there is one breakout today that's going to start doing some of this, mapping the local context, but through the curriculum, we're going to hopefully go much deeper so that you have a much better understanding of what your community looks like, not only in terms of the players, but the dynamics, right? And the relationships that exist. And why is this important again, right? So you're tailoring messaging, you're tailoring communications, right? You're translating for different groups, you're creating coalitions, right? That are very important in terms of promoting sustainability of your programs. So this can be used, right, as a tool for a lot of different things. And then finally, this is my favorite. So thinking about systems change and what does that mean? So this is one framework, right, of systems change. It's called the Waters of Systems Change. And it's built on this premise that in order to create systems change, true system change, we need to shift the conditions that are currently holding a problem in place. I'll say that again because I love it so much. True systems change occurs when we shift the conditions that are currently holding a problem in place. Homelessness exists and persists in our communities because of the conditions that are holding it up and continuing to hold it up, right? So this is a framework that helps us think about what are those conditions. So this framework in particular goes through 6 different conditions or components. Sometimes people think of them as levers, right, that we need to pull and change at different layers or levels of our systems. oftentimes, myself included, right, we go to policies and practices, right? Let's change legislation. Let's change the rules, the requirements, the regulations. Let's change the programs and the activities that we're doing in the community. Those are all great. Those are all certainly conditions, right? But they're just two of them, right? And they're more what we talk about in terms of structural change. They're explicit, they're tangible, they're things we can see. That's often why we go to them, right? So policies, programs, resource flows, what's getting funded and what's not, that's an important condition, right? But as we start going down in this middle row, right, going back to stakeholder mapping and understanding relationships and power dynamics in your community, we also have relational change. How do we change the relationships, the connections, the power dynamics within the community to bring about change? And then finally, mental models. And this is labeled as implicit. And this is where we really talk about transformational change. Think about how difficult it would be in your communities to really truly create transformational change if the prevailing mental model is people are homeless due to their own personal failings, versus a prevailing mental model of people are homeless because of structural inequities, because of a lack of affordable housing, right? How do you change and transform mental models in order to bring about transformational change? It's a difficult question, right? I think when we talked about community champions, that's one potential way, right? Trusted voices in different sectors of your community who are out there helping to change the way people talk about issues or think about issues. That's one way to do it. But what we really want to do in the LIFT Academy is think through all these different conditions. We're not just talking about programs and practices, but how do we shift relationships, shift power dynamics, shift mental models to truly create more holistic transformational change? Okay? This is my favorite. I'll give you a quick example. I spent a lot of time working in child welfare, in the child welfare structure. And I came in at a time, a large transformational federal law passed a few years ago called the Family First Prevention Services Act, okay? It took us years in Colorado to shift, right, to this model, because along with it came tons of changes in legislation, changes in rule, changes in practice, shifts in how the money flowed, for sure, shifts in who was hired in what positions. All of these things we did. All of that's in place right now, right? But actually at the root of that legislation was this shift in mental model that for child welfare, the way to really protect children is not through a punitive model and by removing children from their families and homes. It is about supporting and strengthening families to better care for their children, about providing preventative services, basic goods, and meeting their basic needs, right? Huge shift in mental model, right? How do we change the judges, right, that have to decide if a kid gets to stay at home or not? How do we shift their mental model? How do we shift the mental model of all the caseworkers that are out there deciding if it's safe enough for a kid to stay at home rather than removing them from the home? So there was a ton of this work that we're not even close to shifting yet. We've got all the rules, the policies, everything on paper looks like we are now doing this new model, this new way of child welfare. But for people who are in the system, if you look at the system and how it runs today, it's not that different, right? Because the underlying power dynamics and mental models haven't yet shifted. We have a long way to go in that, right? So just kind of showing how we have to work at these different levels and do the hard work of shifting people's thoughts and relationships, right? And the decisions and how they behave within systems too. That's the deep work of systems change. So we'll get into that. So that's this pillar, right? Fun, right? It encompasses a lot. It is the best pillar. I'm just kidding. But it's kind of how do we interact with individuals, right? Lived experience. How do we engage people in our decision making in a meaningful way, right? And how do we go about doing that? It's about how do we engage with our different parts of our community through champions and messaging. How do we understand the broader dynamics and relationships within our counties or our communities, right? Through mapping some of those dynamics. And then finally, how do we think holistically in terms of systems and all the different levers and conditions we need to be thinking about to bring about change? Oh, wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So just to repeat the question or the comment, right? These systems and conditions exist because someone is benefiting from them. That is why, right? So breaking down these structures is going to threaten some people and some structures in our communities and in our lives, right? So thinking about that is incredibly important. There are people and organizations and institutions, right, that benefit from keeping things the way they are, keeping conditions the way they are, which will continue to perpetuate the problems and the issues that they are holding up. And so how do we address that, right? What are the different strategies to do that? For sure. That's huge. And so when we talk about power dynamics and relationships and connections, right, that's a huge part of this. Who wins and who loses? Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, except I'm agreeing with you. That's a huge thing to think through. Yes. 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 So to paraphrase for the camera, that's a really, really great point. And I think that this fact that in our efforts, right, to include and be inclusive of people with lived experience and others, right, oftentimes it can be performative. People can feel tokenized. There's a lot of that. I remember one of the worst moments of my career. I just told you I'd been spending a lot of time with child welfare and creating some of these systems changes. And we were what we thought intentional about including people with lived child welfare experience in all of our conversations. And someone wrote to me as I was leaving the state and essentially was saying, I felt like that we almost did more harm than good. We reopened some trauma. We made people tell their stories. We made them sit through our hours and hours of heavy policy discussions where we weren't really talking about, right, what they felt like mattered, right? And their voices, they didn't feel like they were heard or were reflective of the final system we created. So I think we have to be very careful when we think about that, right? It's almost in some sectors become the norm to engage people with lived experience, but have we thought through, right? Not just compensation, but all the different ways that we need to change the way we approach our work and the way we have conversations if we're meaningfully and genuinely looking to include people from different walks of life in what we're doing. So I think that's huge. Thank you for bringing that up. And I hope that's the type of discussion we have, right, through this pillar, is how do we do it in a genuine, meaningful way that is truly changing the way we approach the work, right, and the solutions that we put forward. Thank you for that.
Just one thing that we're not talking about is part of how we're building the curriculum outside of what we're hearing from you, but we also included some of our own research into with lived experience and like making sure that how we are building that into the curriculum is not just informed by the folks in this room, but people with lived experience across the state. I think one area where we will differ from the feedback that we're hearing is centering lived experience. That's one area that's not the highest pain point in some of our surveys so far. People are a lot more worried about funding, a lot more worried about continuing programs. But just to say out loud, we're saying it now, but we weren't planning to say it, but that's something that we are keeping at the center. And that's why we're talking about this before we're talking about our program feedback and excellence. So it's there, and we part of the reason there's so many ways to engage with us is because we want to hear if there are things that you all feel like we're not doing well enough. So please give us that feedback. I don't know if anybody on our team actively right now has had lived experience. So how do we incorporate that into what we're building, right? So just give us feedback. Let us know where we're failing.
Any other questions or comments? Yes. Great. So including the modifier intentional with this pillar was very intentional, that we need to be intentional in all of these things, right? We are not doing things for the sake of doing things. Just like there was a comment about HMIS, right? All of the things that we're spending energy doing, we are not doing it for the sake of. We are doing it in service of what? Right? What is the intention? What is the outcome we are driving towards? And if all of these things aren't in service of the outcomes we want, why are we doing them? Okay, so really focusing on the intention. Thank you for underscoring that. Anyone else? This turned into a nice interactive session. Okay, well then I think I'll turn it over to Cassie and Rebecca to bring us to the third pier.
I know Yumiko said that her pillar is the best pillar. And who am I to argue? I think everyone will have a pillar that resonates, but also just want to focus on the fact that all of these three pillars are interconnected. So funding sustainability is on folks' minds, intentional inputs as well. And then Cassie and I are going to talk about programmatic excellence. So folks in the room, you are all Thor grantees. And I'm going to ask you to think about a question. You don't have to raise your hand. I'm not going to quiz anybody. But when we think about homelessness being rare, brief, and non-recurring, so many a year ago, the federal strategic plan was released with this concept of we're making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So we try to prevent homelessness from happening. It's rare. When it does, we are quickly moving people to housing, brief, and then folks are staying housing. It's not recurring. And someone probably should be getting royalties for that because it's brilliant and we've really latched on to this. It's an easy concept to understand. That's what we want. But think to yourself, for my program, do I know or can I quickly access information of how quickly are we moving folks from the time they enter our program to being matched to housing to lease up? Are we tracking that folks are not coming back into a homeless situation? Are folks leaving to a permanent housing solution versus another housing solution? Or non-housing solution, excuse me. So I think just think to yourself, is that information that I have my hands on? And for other folks that are on my team that are working with Thor grants and other grants, is that information that they have their hands on? Are we taking that as a team and looking at that and really digging in? And this is where we get a little nitty gritty. There are a lot of good systems conversations. There are a lot of big ideas, but are we just really getting granular and taking the data that we have that we've put a lot of time into? And Yumiko just mentioned, is the HMIS data in service to something? So I think just something that we'll really be digging into together is, do we have good, accurate data, and how are we using it to improve our programs? Yeah, I'll try to summarize that briefly. So Sarah's talking about our inflow, folks coming into the system, versus our outflow, folks that are being housed, and how are we addressing that inflow with prevention, with diversion, with a strategy that I think has been hard for us I know for Metro Denver, that's been a hard strategy to latch onto and plan and be really intentional around. And I'm guessing the same around the state. So I think that's a great point made, Sarah. Before I want to hide this slide before I go to it because I know Cassie's Zillow slide created a lot. However, we know that to have programmatic excellence, we need to have staff. We need the adequate number of staff to support the program. We need folks that are trained and ready to do the work. And the work is hard. So that notwithstanding, I think this is an excellent example of where the three pillars fit together. And we've talked to a lot of folks over the last few weeks who say, we want to prioritize our staff. We want to have capacity. We want to fill open roles. We would like to pay competitively and attract and, sustain great staff. However, that funding sustainability kind of comes into play. So this is just, I think, a really good example of the connectedness of our three pillars. The other one is creating our leadership pipelines. So we are bringing on good staff. We are paying competitively. We are providing good trainings that are standardized across our sector. And we're providing that pipeline for folks to advance in the work, including folks with lived expertise. And I'll share a quick anecdote here. Years ago, when I was at the COC, I stood up here Navigator program. And we were able to fund and train and have peer navigators working with some of our direct service providers. And it was one of the biggest learning experiences I have had professionally, and wonderful, until we got to the end of our funding. And same old story. But I think some of our partners were reticent to advance folks to other roles in their organization versus saying, this is a peer navigator, and they will be a peer navigator. So I think really thinking about when we're bringing folks with lived expertise, how are we training and developing folks to be at all levels of our organizations? And how are we prioritizing that? I know at MDHI, we put that in our job application that we give, prioritization to folks with lived expertise. I've talked to other folks in the room that do the same or similar. So how are we bringing that all together and bringing our lived expertise onto our staff? And then the staff support and well-being. I've heard some really cool ideas. And one thing I'm very excited about with the Lift Academy is our opportunity for peer learning. So talking to folks and different ideas that you all have, talk to an organization where someone was out on sabbatical. Well, that's cool. That might be a good idea to prevent burnout. And I think within our room and outside our room, we will be able to come up with a lot of good ideas for how we support our staff and their well-being. But I think really kind of going back to that staff development and standards and how we're raising up our staff, this is a great opportunity. As Summer mentioned, you can be a graduate of Lift Academy. So how cool is that? And then really we want to make sure we're ensuring our operational excellence. So data-driven improvements, integrating our services, and creating strategic partnerships. So I think Tanya laid this out really well. We need to dig in and look at where we are and work together to really create steps and a plan for how we're going to move these forward. I think we hear so much about data-driven improvements, and I just talked about it a little bit, but that is really where we need to start. Are you coordinating your housing, health, mental health, and job support? It might be co-located, but there might be partnerships that you have yet to make that will integrate that for your program. And then the strategic partnerships. So again, I think this is where we link with Yumiko, but it all feeds into our programmatic excellence. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, I apologize in advance to our camera person. I'm gonna pull a Tanya. I'm gonna move. I'm gonna hop down over here. So we're about 4 of 6 slides into program excellence. We haven't once talked about a program model. I just wanna name that, right? We're not gonna be teaching you about progressive engagement. We're not gonna be deciding how housing focused your shelter needs to be. Part of what we're going to get into is looking at your agency as a whole and how your whole agency impacts the direct services that you're providing to people. And I think it was Tanya who said earlier, right? We're going to be asking program people to look at financials. We're going to be asking financial people to look at programs. We're going to be looking at this in a very different way. I'm seeing some nods. Love that. So I just want to name that before we go into this next slide, my table talking about systems. You're going to love the animations on my next slide. Very excited about it. If my clicker works. Where are we pointing? There we go. All right. So in light of that, we've talked about this a little bit, right? Homelessness exists in a cycle. We're continuing to push people into more vulnerabilities before we're able to serve them, out of good intention, but out of, like, that's the reality, right? There's more inflow, there's fewer resources, and you have to sort of go through this cycle in order to actually get services. And so what we're going to be looking at is how we use our programs, the tools that we do have, to create off-ramps as much as we can. There are going to be some things that we can't control, right? We live in a capital society. That's the truth. But how do we build these programs? I only said it once. How do we build these programs in a way that actually creates off-ramps as we go through? So when we start looking at sort of unaffordable housing, generational poverty, low wages, ongoing medical debt, how do we create an off-ramp that focuses on housing navigation, that focuses on stabilizing housing, not increasing vulnerabilities before people can get served, but building incomes, building resilience, maintaining that housing as the key foundation here. If we're not able to do that, folks move into housing instability. There's more barriers that are created. How do we create an off-ramp? Where is the, oh, thank you, yes. Off-ramp is the Q word, yeah. Great, thank you. That gets people back into housing as quickly as possible. How do we lower those barriers? How do we create person-centered services that build trust and reduce red tape? I feel like it's okay for me to say that because I used to work for the government. How do we remove those barriers that we've almost sort of intrinsically created for ourselves as program designs? If we can't do that, we know folks are going to be overrepresented in criminal justice. No, I didn't say off-ramp. We know folks are going to be overrepresented in criminal justice, mental health, and addiction services. So how do we create an off-ramp? How do we work with those partners, right? We're not asking you all in the room to become experts on all of this. How do we find those community champions and leverage those partnerships so that they identify for us who's their high utilizer, who's going to be part of the focus that we should be having? If we can't do this, we know folks move into chronic health issues, substance abuse, and premature death. I think the average age is 44 for someone who's living on the street compared to 77, although that might be a little lower now. That's a little bit of an old statistic. But how do we create an off-ramp there? Because at this point, it's better for everyone in the community to house somebody financially, emotionally, structurally. So how do we build off-ramps so that we're not keeping people languishing in the streets, but actually moving them into the housing that's affordable? So that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about system excellence. We're going to look at that at the program level. Part of why we're talking about those intentional inputs is so that you know who in your community fits here and where you fit. This is a very wordy slide. I had more words on it before, but our programs are here in the center, right? You all are the front line of this work. So how do we strengthen that work that you're doing to help you create these off-ramps in ways that are meaningful, that actually reduce that inflow over time? Next slide. So for folks who are going to be involved in the LIFT curriculum at any level, but especially folks who are getting TA, the program excellence, what's the word? What do you get? Syllabus. The program excellence syllabus for in day one of college. We're going to start with that HMIS data, right? We want the anecdotes, we want the stories, but we want to know the nuts and bolts. How many people are we housing? How quickly are we housing them? And how long are they staying housed? Those are our three core questions. We're going to look at where we are, kind of mirroring Tanya's financials. What are the pain points? How's our staffing? What's the workload like? Are folks trained to deal with what's coming to them every day? Understanding those internal and external inputs, because there's some stuff that we can control and there's some stuff that we can't, that we have to plan for. And we're going to build a financial need around where we want to go. If we don't plan for where we want to go, how are we ever going to get there, right? We might not get to where we're going, but we have to at least start with a plan to get there. And then determining the path forward. This is really where the one-on-one TA is going to build in. Anybody at any level of the LIFT curriculum is going to get skills to be able to build these structures, but really digging in nuts and bolts. And when we get into the one-on-one TA, that's where we're going to get into things like progressive engagement, these really specific housing-focused shelter models and things like that. But we're not going to start at that point. We're going to work with folks to really vision where they are and where they want to go. We're trying to talk slowly because I think we're running early. So I'll ask, are there any questions? emotional responses, processing we want to do. I'm going to stop walking so much. I apologize. Comments are allowed? No? All right. We've solved everything, right? We're just hitting the boxes for what you all need. Yeah, okay. Get ready. We're about to ask you to get up.
So we get the sense that you all have some thoughts and want to do some talking as well. So you've just heard a quick kind of rundown summary of the curriculum, some of the big topics that we were thinking of addressing. So we'd love for you to just take some time at your individual tables, right, to talk through what of this really resonates with you and where your organization or program is. What were some ahas? What do you want to dive into deeper? So we'd love for you to just take a moment, reflect on kind of those three pillars, right? Financial, sustainability, intentional inputs, programmatic excellence. How does all of this seem to apply to where you are right now? And also, as questions or thoughts come up in your discussions, please make sure you utilize the cards, the question cards on your tables. Again, we keep asking, right? We want feedback. We want to know what your questions are so we can better, right, adjust our curriculum to meet your needs. So please utilize those cards and drop them in the bucket in the back. But yeah, so take some time and have some small group discussions. And then we'll let you know when it's time to take a break for lunch.